Hello, everyone. In the last lecture, we were discussing difference between interfaces and abstract classes. Uh, and so what we discussed is that if you have an inheritance hierarchy, then perhaps you should prefer abstract classes instead of interfaces. In terms of methods and attributes, um, if you have any attribute that is supposed to be non-static, then perhaps you should think about making your class an abstract class rather than an interface. And likewise, if you have any method that is that should be private or maybe protected, then this is also a pointer that maybe you should think about making your class as an abstract class rather than making a class as an interface, given that you would want other child classes to have access of that abstract class and that interface. Okay, so if you have a choice, then perhaps you should look at these these attributes and methods, given if there is any non-static attribute, or if there is any method that you would want to be private and protected, then perhaps make that class as an abstract class rather than an interface. And then in terms of inheritance, you can have an interface that basically extends multiple interfaces, but in abstract classes you cannot have that. You can have a class that extends only a single class, basically. In terms of interface body, you can have three different types of methods. So the first ones are the abstract methods, the other ones are default methods, and the third type of methods are static ones. So by abstract methods, I mean that, for example, if we look at the slide, so we discussed this relatable interface, and in here we have this get area method, which by default is is abstract. So if there's I don't need to write explicit abstract keyword. If I'm defining some method with only signatures with no default implementation, then this method get area method is abstract. But then we also discussed that you can have a bare bone definition of your method as well. Okay, so this int is larger than method. I'm actually providing a default implementation of this method within my interface itself. Okay, initially we saw that just maybe simply provide declaration, but you can also have this default method, so-called. So abstract get area method is an abstract method, is larger than method is a default method. So apart from these two, you can also have static methods. If you want to define some static method that is to be related with this relatable interface, you can also do that. So these are the three methods that that can be defined within the interface itself. In terms of abstract classes, so we are not saying like in C++, we used to have this notion that any class that has at least one abstract method is an abstract class, but this definition isn't valid over here. Okay, because this definition also is valid for interfaces as well. So in Java, the abstract class will be defined by this abstract keyword, which is to be written while you're declaring the class itself or defining the class itself. And then given that you declare some class as an abstract one, it may or may not have abstract methods by default. So you can also have you can also have some default implementations within your abstract classes as well. Now and then if you, let's say, if you take an abstract class and then you basically subclass that, like you inherit, you extend that abstract class into your subclasses, what should happen is that you should provide implementations of all your abstract methods of your parent class. If you do not do that, then your child classes should also be declared as abstract classes. Okay, which means that you cannot instantiate your child classes as well. If you have some methods in it, like, so by default, all methods in the interface are implicitly abstract. Okay, so if you do not use static, or if you do not have static and a default method, implicitly that will be abstract as well. Okay, so just in this case, for example, in here, this is a default method, but this get area method isn't a default method. It is also not a static method. So by default it is implicitly abstract method. But having some abstract method doesn't mean that your class is also abstract. This is just an interface that contains some abstract method. Okay, so now so these were the similarities and differences between your interfaces and abstract classes. Now if you have to, let's say, modify an interface. So imagine that if let's say if I have this interface that has some method, and then I simply you know then imagine that I have 10 different implementations of this interface. Okay, and one designer has implemented this interface differently. The second implementation of this interface has some overridden method that does something different. Okay, so well, I have designed this interface, but other software developers have basically implemented those interface, that abstract that interface differently in their own implementations. And then what happens is that if some new developer joins in, and then he says that, okay, I'm going to modify this interface, or I'm going to modify it by by adding some function as well, some customized function as well. Okay, now then the compiler will say that, okay, let's say if you want to add some functionality in your interface, then your existing implementations of that interface should also implement this new function that you have defined. Now this creates problem, because I'm not sure how many sub interfaces are implementing my base interface. So there are two options to solve this. Well, there are basically three options, but the third option is practically infeasible. I cannot expect every other developer to write some method that I have just come up, right? So you don't want to redefine, you don't want to make any changes in your child sub interfaces. Okay, so what you can do is that you can simply say that, okay, you don't need to define this this sumf method everywhere. Just use this default implementation of this sumf function. And in here I'm saying that, okay, I'm providing some bare bone implementation, which is basically nothing. Okay, so this is the default implementation. Now anyone who can choose this, anyone, let's say your child sub interfaces, can simply ignore this default method. Okay, so this is one option of adding new functionalities in your sub interfaces. The second option is to not do changes in your base interface at all. Just create a new interface, and then say that your new interface will extend your base interface, and then simply simply provide your whatever your new method is. Don't need to default. I'm simply saying that, okay, public void new f. Okay, so there are two options: either either make that function default, or just create a new sub interface that extends your base interface, and then provide whatever new functionalities that you think are feasible to add into this do it interface. Right, so this is how you would modify your existing interfaces, given that already implementations of that base interface exist within your code base. And then there are some nuances. For example, if you have some if you are extending an interface that has some default implementation of some method, if you can simply choose to if you redefine your default method, then it will, like your new implementation in your sub interface will in your implementation class will override that that method. If you do not basically redeclare or redefine that method, your subclasses will use the default implementation of your base interface. But then you can also do that, just for example, you can say that, okay, I have some interface that has some default implementation, then I extend that interface by some other interface, and then I'm saying that, okay, there is this do something else method that is defined in my base interface, but then I'm extending it, and then I'm saying that, okay, now I'm saying that, okay, I'm not actually defining that, redefining that that default method. I'm actually, declaring that method as abstract. What this means is that now you cannot have any class that implements, this child interface, because you are declaring this method, as an abstract. If you just provide some base implementation, and then, okay, say that, okay, this is default implementation of this method, or then it will allow you. So if you have some default implementation and you override it, then it's perfectly okay. But if you do not, if you do not provide an alternative implementation, and you simply say that, okay, I'm just declaring the same function that I have defined in my base interface, then this will make this interface, you cannot implement your you cannot have any class that can actually implement your interface, because then it will make this class as an abstract class. Okay, so the implementation of this do it interface will not be possible. Now so this is somewhat similar. So you cannot you cannot use objects to call static methods, even if those static methods are present both in your base class and your child class. If you have some class that extends some base class and implements multiple interfaces, and let's say if you have a method which is defined in your horse class and also in your two interfaces, we have this identify myself method that is present in all of these three things, in your base class and also in flyer and mythical interface. If you have some class that extends some base class and implements two or three interfaces, and all of these two interfaces share a method with this horse class as well, then by default the method that is present within the horse class, since this horse class the method is an instance method, it will be preferred over the methods that are provided by those interfaces. Okay, so by default, any implementation of the function that exists within your class will be preferred than the same implementations available in your interfaces. And then another thing is that if, for example, if you have a class that implements a couple of interfaces, and one interface provides some implementation of your method, while another interface does not provide any implementation, the method that provides some implementation will be preferred than the one that doesn't. So we have fire breather interface that does basically nothing, and then we have egg-layer interface that has some default implementation of identify myself. So the default the implementation that will be exposed to this main class will be that which exists in either egg layer or Firebreather. If the implementation exists in both of these classes or both of these interfaces, then the compiler will throw some sort of an error. So the method will be, the implementation should be available only in one of your in one of your base interfaces. There is this super keyword that helps in in calling your base method within your derived class. So for example, if you have some base class having some implementation of some method, and then you have some class that extends your base class and that also has some implementation of the same method, within your child method you can call the print method of your base class using this super keyword. Okay, just like you can call your constructor of your base class from your constructor of child class, you can basically call any method of your base class from within your child class. Okay, so that's it. In the next video, we are going to see collections in Java.